These kids are going to live in a world that is so fundamentally different than you and I grew up in. And we have got to figure out a curriculum framework that will enable them to know what is most important and be able to apply it at very, very high levels. Now, how you go about that, I'm going to turn to my colleague, Dick Jones, and ask Dick to walk you through that. Dick?
Thanks, Bill, and I want to thank Helen for that. That's the best introduction I've ever had. And next time that you ask me to give you something to introduce me, I will give you something to introduce me. It's nice to have the opportunity to work with Bill. Bill and I have shared a lot of experiences for many years, and the exciting opportunity to work on many different things. And yes, I do remember that late evening in Seattle where we sketched out some ideas to what would become the Rigor and Relevant framework. And we had no idea at the time that it would become as pervasive as it has and as powerful as it has in helping teachers think about their instruction in different ways. And through this last decade plus that we've been struggling to implement standards, and Bill's talked about why data is important in getting to the right priority standards, it really has brought to the forefront the value of the Rigor and Relevant framework, because the standards don't delineate the level of performance. They don't say whether it's quadrant A, B, C, or D, and we've helped states begin to understand that. Now, when you go to write a state assessment, you have to make that decision as to what quadrant you want the performance in. It's easier to test most of that in quadrant A, so that's where those assessments end up. But when you move from deciding what the priority standards are and moving into that curriculum, which is different than the standards, that's where the Rigor and Relevant framework comes to play. And Bill's given you a brief introduction to that, and we want to go a little bit deeper in this session this afternoon. And we have other materials that you can follow through on your own to do some self-study to understand this further in your own instructional applications. The framework starts with the thinking continuum that moves from just acquiring knowledge on up through the full assimilation of knowledge that some people call the habits of thinking. And that's best known by the knowledge taxonomy that Bloom and others created 50, 60 years ago and has been ingrained so much in a part of teacher education. That starts with a level of awareness. Can I recall facts and information, know my math facts, and so forth? It's the foundation of most curriculum. Moves on up to a level of understanding and then to an aspect of applying skills. Levels 4, 5, and 6 are analysis, synthesis, and evaluation. Some people refer to these as the higher level thinking skills because there's an awful lot of interrelationship between these, and we engage students in work that has aspects of analysis, then they often have to synthesize and create their own work, and those are natural tendencies of moving into activities at that higher level. This is not new, and many of us have had experiences working with curriculum. When Bill and I that evening got sketching out some ideas to try and do a Rigor and Relevant framework, we weren't trying to come up with a novel idea to write a book or to hold a conference around. What we really were doing was reflecting on a conference that we'd been doing for 2 days or a workshop for 2 days that hadn't gone as well as we expected. We didn't felt we really met the community needs because we were trying to help them sort out world-class standards. Remember a lot of discussion in the 80s that those of you who were involved in curriculum, we kept tossing around these terms, world-class standards. And everybody was embracing the idea and saying this is what we need to do is embrace world-class standards. Well, after a little bit of probing, everybody realized there weren't any such thing as world-class standards. So we had to try and define those ourselves. And we started with the knowledge taxonomy. And we listened to the community members as to what they wanted young people to know and be able to do. And some of those conversations didn't fit very neatly on this knowledge taxonomy. And we were trying to take the things that we listened and heard from the community and to put that into a framework. And we said there's got to be a better way to capture this notion of what we really mean by higher level skills. And just higher levels of cognition doesn't do it. When we think about a lot of instruction, you can take, and when we do curriculum planning workshops, you can take any area of learning and think about where that falls on the knowledge taxonomy. And most people are comfortable doing that. Here's an example from basic nutrition. You can label foods by nutritional groups in the food pyramid. as to where they fall in those individual categories, as in a recall activity. That would be level 1 on the knowledge taxonomy. Being able to explain nutritional values for different foods and some of the characteristics of those aspects of nutrition, that's what we mean by understanding. It's a little higher level of comprehension in being able to explain things in your own terms, some level of understanding. Application could be defined by having students set some nutritional guidelines in planning individual meals. So now they're taking what they know and they're applying that to an individual situation. That would be level 3 on the knowledge taxonomy. Analysis might be something like examine success in achieving nutritional goals. Am I making progress? Do I need to modify my individual diet? That requires a higher level thinking skill on that taxonomy. A synthesis activity might be to develop personal nutrition goals. Now the student has to create a plan of their own using information that they have, other things that they collect, and create that and develop those specific goals. Level 6, where we're looking at the highest level of evaluation, might be something by appraising results of personal eating habits over a period of time. In each of these, you can see higher levels of thinking that's necessary to perform that task. And as teachers, when you decide the end point of your instruction, usually demonstrated by a test, a quiz, some measure of performance, you set that level of cognition, sometimes accidentally, sometimes deliberately, in trying to get students to a higher level of thinking. Well, as we tried to put all curriculum into that kind of scheme, we found some difficulties. And that led us to create the application model that Bill's explained. It moves from just acquiring knowledge on to the other extreme of really applying that knowledge in very sophisticated ways. One of the experiences that I had that really pointed out and reinforced this notion that there was a difference in applying skills occurred several years ago when I was with the State Education Department, and we were setting up a survey of skills, basic skills in the workplace. Bill, I don't know if you remember that project that we did back in the late 80s of going out and actually interviewing workers and trying to categorize the level of reading and the level of math that was required on individual jobs. This was before any of the work that had been done on state standards in this country. And we ran a training session, and we had a hierarchy or a taxonomy for categorizing the skills. And we trained a group of teachers, and we tested it out for them to use this protocol by going and interviewing hotel workers in the hotel that we were meeting in. And afterwards, we came back, and there was one reading teacher that she was sharing her experience. We asked them to go and interview the worker and then to collect some samples about what they had to read. And she asked this front desk clerk that she was interviewing, what's something that you've had to read today so I can categorize the level of sophistication of that reading? And he said, well, here's something that happened a few minutes ago. I had someone rush in, and I was waiting on several customers. They were getting a little impatient. And this man jumped to the front of the line, shoved a letter in front of me, and said, here, read this letter and tell me where I need to be at my meeting. I'm late. So I had to read the letter and answer this man's question. So as the reading teacher's relaying this story, she was kind of smiling, and she said, as he was talking about the reading that he was doing, I was thinking about the way that I went about teaching my students to read. And that was to find a quiet place free of distractions, skim over the material, then read it carefully and review it one more time to make sure you have the key points. Reading in the real world was different than reading in an instructional context. When we think about being able to apply skills, just because you've learned and acquired that knowledge doesn't mean you're able to do that with all the stresses and distractions that occur in the real world. That's a measure of higher level learning as well. And that application model has 5 levels, as we've talked about. Moving from knowledge in one discipline to applying knowledge in the discipline. Can I learn vocabulary words, and then can I use those words correctly in doing some writing? Can I apply instruction or apply the knowledge across the discipline, the interdisciplinary aspects? Particularly in secondary schools, students come to understand that there's math classes and science classes and social studies classes, and they don't think they have to necessarily use that same knowledge because knowledge is compartmentalized. And we need to break that kind of perception. It's really a higher level of application. Being able to apply in real-world predictable situations, a measure of higher degrees of application, and then finally being able to apply in real-world unpredictable. When we think about the details of curriculum development, we can distinguish different levels of student performance the same way along that particular scale. We can start with something basic, if I use the same nutrition, of labeling foods by nutrition groups in that food pyramid. That's acquiring knowledge within the discipline. To apply it, if I have to rank foods, I'm given a whole number of food items, and now I have to take this food pyramid and categories and figure out where those foods fall. That's a little bit more complex now that I'm applying what I've learned. If I'm making cost comparisons of foods, considering nutritional values, interdisciplinary aspect, developing nutritional plan for a health problem affected by food, that's a real-world application. It's not nice, neat applying the pyramid. How do I now use that with a real situation with some variables? And then if you really want to get sophisticated in the unpredictable, how do I do that with a 3-year-old who's a picky eater, and you can't just say everything is going to be a part of their individual diet? Great deal of complexity in moving up that particular scale. When we think about instruction and teachers making decisions about what's the end point of what this instruction is going to include, you see higher levels of sophistication. All of these examples relate to basic nutrition. When we say we're teaching basic nutrition, you need to get specific about what quadrant you're working in related to the rigor and relevant framework. Now, we've done a lot of curriculum analysis over the years by those two different scales, but we've found that it's much easier to bring those into this relational framework where we have application as the horizontal axis, knowledge as the vertical axis, divide that into 4 quadrants, so we can talk about the A quadrant, the quadrant that are low rigor, low relevance, those skills that are foundation skills in any discipline that require the recall of information and facts. Useful knowledge, but you may not have practice in applying that particular knowledge. And those over in quadrant B are the real-world applications of those skills. Becomes higher level skills in the dimension that there's more demands, just like that young man reading as a front desk clerk is a different situation than reading in a classroom. Higher levels of expectation in the degrees of application of skills. And quadrant C are those skills that require much more complex thinking, the kinds of things that we expect students to do in multi-step problems. They need to bring prior knowledge that maybe everything isn't on the worksheet for them to do. Those kinds of things require students to think in more complex ways, handle more difficult problems. That shows a higher level of learning. That we're comfortable in doing in education. And the combination of those of high rigor and relevance is quadrant D. And what Bill showed you with the examples of talking about the changes in our society and the introductions of technology, there's just going to become more and more demand for D-level skills. It's not just a matter of recalling information. It's a matter of how do we apply that particular knowledge. The challenge in instruction is to think about how we can get to quadrant D. And not all learning is going to occur in that realm. We do a lot of training of teachers in various situations, sometimes 3 or 4 day workshops, sometimes short workshops, to get them to understand the rigor and relevant framework and apply this to their own learning. And in many cases, it reinforces what they know about good instruction, but it's also interesting to have conversations with students and think about the way the students react to the rigor and relevant framework. They latch onto this very quickly. When we were doing the student focus groups as part of the high-performing school visits, some of these focus groups, we were able to get into these conversations with students, and they tracked on very quickly what quadrant D is as far as the level of learning. What I'd like to do now is just to run again that video clip that Bill showed this morning from Kennesaw Mountain, where students were describing their quadrant D experiences from their particular school.
Developed by the International Center for Leadership and Education, D-Quadrant lessons combine the higher levels of Bloom's taxonomy, analysis, synthesis, and evaluation, with application models that cross disciplines and involve predictable and unpredictable real-world situations, thereby creating activities that are both rigorous and relevant. Kennesaw Mountain High School is proud to present Lessons in the D-Quadrant. Mustang Stop is managed by marketing students who take concepts learned in class and apply them to the real-world environment of a mall-like store. Students meet vendors, develop new lines of clothing, do market research involving products and pricing, and design advertising layouts and promotions targeted to different groups. They are also responsible for the running of the store, open to the public on a daily basis.
We don't have time to go through the entire tape on that, but a couple of things that come out, reinforcing the notion that young people understand this very quickly about what it's like to be involved in Quadrant D. Those Quadrant D activities are also very visual in the kinds of images that you saw there of students actually doing things. When we talk about in curriculum workshops getting teachers to understand this Quadrant D, we ask them to think about the student work that would be characterized in that particular quadrant. One of the ways that we do that often is by showing some video clips. And if you're looking at ways that you can carry this back to your colleagues and getting them to understand the print materials, that's a little hard when you don't have to, someone like Bill or myself to begin to explain those particular ideas. But a short introduction of that and then looking at some videos of instruction. It's probably better to do someone who's not a teacher in your own school so you don't get into that kind of analysis. But looking at some instruction and say, okay, what quadrant of instruction does this really exist in? That stimulates some great conversations about whether that truly was a Quadrant D performance. Was it real world in the kinds of things that we saw students engaged in? Did it require complex thinking? Did it require students taking responsibility, doing some analysis, doing some synthesis, and moving those on up into what we would characterize as Quadrant D? One of the video clips that I often use in those workshops, and I'd encourage you to go take a look at it in this different frame, are the video pieces that came out of the TIMS study, the Third International Math and Science Study. See, it's been 8 years since that initial research was done, but still some very valuable information, particularly on looking at the instruction. And in many ways, the instruction hasn't changed a great deal in what was characterized in that research. There particularly were some detailed videos of Japanese, German, and US classrooms. And particularly looking at the US classrooms, you see an energetic teacher working hard, helping to reinforce a concept that the students have been practicing applications on a worksheet. And I've engaged teachers in that conversation and say, what quadrant do you think the teacher expected the performance to be at? Did they really accomplish that? And what were the areas of learning? And when you're kind of taking a peek at that other classroom, you begin to understand that that teacher had some high expectations, but really didn't achieve those because of the activities and the way that that classroom played out. And that leads us to looking at how do we use this rigor and relevant framework to look at an instructional process when we take that into the classroom. The level of rigor and relevance should be a deliberate action by the teacher. What level do you really want the student performance to be at? It does take more time, it does take more resources to get students to Quadrant D, but once you have them there, they retain that knowledge. And so one of the decisions that you need to make in curriculum planning is, do you want the students to retain the knowledge past the end of the chapter test or the end of the semester test or the state examination? If we really want students to be able to apply that knowledge once they leave school, that hopefully is our objective, then we ought to have more of those experiences in Quadrant D. And if we can prioritize the standards and pull off those standards that are most important, then when we plan those lessons, we want to put experiences in that are Quadrant D. And by running teachers through some instructional planning and reflecting on individual classrooms, they can understand what Quadrant D begins to look like. That's one of the powerful ways that you can bring this into a planning process. Some of the resources that we've put together over the years to help schools work with these, or work with the framework that I'd recommend that you take a look at. This Planning Rigorous and Relevant Instruction Guide was one that we really wrote down a lot of the things that occurred in our workshops of working with individual teachers. And more recently, to come to understand the Rigor and Relevant framework, we put together this Rigor and Relevant handbook a year ago, which was an example of describing in much more detail the kinds of learning experiences. We often focus on language arts and math because those are tested areas. But we went into social studies and put in dozens of different examples in social studies at different grade levels of what does quadrant A, B, and C, D learning look like in each of those disciplines. So if you're trying to share with colleagues what the rigor and relevant framework is, that's a rich resource that you can help to explain and give us some examples that they can bring this back to their own instruction. And when you think about taking those individual standards and mapping those out to the instruction that goes on, to get teachers in the practice of asking the question, what's the level of rigor and relevance that we want? And once you do that, to make sure that you test to that level of rigor and relevance. If you expect students to be performing in quadrant D, then you better be testing in quadrant D, because it's the test that really drives the emphasis within the curriculum. And so you can have high aspirations and say, yes, I want to take students to quadrant D, and then you end up giving them a multiple choice test at the end, and that really doesn't test whether they had that real world, high level, high rigor performance as a part of that. Likewise, when you're considering the state tests, as we must do, where the vast majority of those questions are in quadrant A, that tends to drive us to a performance in the A quadrant that may not be our desire. So one of the challenges is figuring out how do we balance that to move between each of the four quadrants. The other thing that I often tell teachers in looking and moving to quadrant D is that it isn't possible to do that with everything. Usually when a teacher's putting together a unit plan, there usually are a variety of experiences. And we ask them to break down in any unit of instruction, whether that's a couple of week period of time, what are the specific examples of student work that you expect students to do? There may be a body of knowledge that you expect them to recall that information. That may be still important. And that's one of the work pieces that they have to do. But there may be a project that they have to design, a problem that they have to solve. There may be a research report that they write or a presentation that they give. That if you think about that area of curriculum you're trying to teach in terms of student work, and then each of those pieces of student work label the quadrant that you expect students to be in. Do you expect that in quadrant A, B, C, or D? And if the student or the teacher makes that deliberate, conscious expectation up front, that makes the rest of that planning lessons much easier. Because then you move to what assessments are going to be appropriate for that. Multiple choice tests may be fine for an expectation in quadrant A. But if you're expecting students to be in quadrant B or D, then you're going to have some performance assessment, something more authentic in the way that you assess student performance. In this whole area of assessment, sometimes we go around trumpeting that performance or authentic assessment is much better than multiple choice. That's not true. It all depends upon the level of rigor and relevance. Multiple choice is a great form of assessment if you expect performance in quadrant A. But if you expect performance in B or D, that's when you want to use more authentic forms of assessment. And I've often seen teachers struggling with this notion of different forms of assessment and the whole bandwagon about authentic assessment. It's not that some assessments are good or bad, it's a matter of being consistent through your instruction. And helping teachers work their way through that with the rigor and relevant framework can be a very powerful application of that tool in saying what we're really about is being consistent. What's the expected level that we want the student performance to be as part of our curriculum? And let's make sure we test to that particular level. And that's going to set a much more coherent fashion in the way that you put instruction together. Just to give you a couple more of examples, Bill shared a couple of these, and these are the kinds of things that we do a lot more in the particular handbook. Any area of learning, you can think about performance in any one of these four quadrants. If you took something like Homeland Security, in the A quadrant, if you're just trying to recall information, you're trying to identify and classify different levels of security types that might be involved in certain amounts of risk. In quadrant B, you're looking at real-world application. You're looking to explain the factors that might be considered in setting up a security situation for a certain location or a certain type of risk, because there you're evaluating what's the real world that's happening and how can I take that into consideration in designing a security system. High rigor in quadrant C is where you're trying to compare and contrast different systems. That's the analysis skill that you're often doing. So here you're requiring students to go through a much more cognitive exercise where there are several different options on security systems, and they need to, what are the advantages of each of those, the cost benefits of those, multiple steps that they have to go through in doing some research to analyze those, to compare different security systems. And in quadrant D, would be to actually create a system, giving students a situation that's a real-world situation, that they'd have to take what they know about different security systems and actually create one, real-world, complex. So you can see the different level of performance in each one of those. If we take something like heredity, that we're trying to teach basic genetics and hereditary traits, in quadrant A, you're only asking them to categorize genetic information. What are the kinds of traits that are inherited? Some basic, simple recall that many of us learned in middle-level biology. Over to the right-hand side in quadrant B, now you've got to get to an aspect of explaining why those traits occur in a real-world situation. If you make observations about hair color or eye color in a family or other inherited traits, is to try and identify and relate those back to what you know about genetic information. That's a real-world application of knowledge, not just answering questions in a chapter test. And up to the quadrant C is being able to observe, analyze, and explain some aspect of heredity in terms of genetic information. Again, where you may be doing some research, collecting a lot more information to try and relate that back to what you know on heredity. And being able to select and justify a research study to try and figure out if certain traits are inherited is what research scientists do. That's a real-world application of genetic information related to heredity. So any area of learning, you can begin to categorize it in each of one of those four quadrants. And that's what we'd encourage you to begin to think about in your own work within instruction. It's a natural step of moving from the priority of standards. That tells you how we can focus the agenda. But then to make sure we've got the right curriculum by constantly asking questions about the rigor and relevance that's there in doing that. And with the beauty of the rigor and relevant framework, it's such a simple tool. You've got it now, you know that information, and you can go forth and use it. Sure, there's other materials that you can use to help to explain that to others. But the thing that makes it so effective is that it's so easy to understand and is so pervasive in the ways that it can be applied.